Hello, we're going to be going over the aggregate demand and aggregate supply long and short run non-price factor determinants. So, to start off with aggregate demand, the non-price factors or determinants, we want to think of aggregate demand as the same thing as GDP and think about what creates GDP, which, as we know, GDP consists of consumption plus investment plus government spending, plus net exports. So our non-price determinants of aggregate demand is going to be the exact same thing as GDP. So first thing we have is consumption, which can be many things like changes in consumer preferences. Consumer confidence. Along with changes in disposable income or even demographics and population group and those type of things. The next thing, of course, is investment, which can bring changes in interest rates, or even tech changes. The next thing is government spending, which can occur with different policy changes. I'm using the triangle here if you can't tell to represent change. And then net exports, which is the same thing as exports minus imports. There we go. Which can bring different exchange rates and trade policies. There we go. Now that is for the aggregate demand non-price factors. Now moving on to aggregate short-run supply non-price determinant factors. Our very first one is going to be input prices. Think of like changes in wages or changes in raw materials. Next up, we have technology. There we go. Next up is taxes and subsidies. Along with government regulations. There we go. And these are the short-run supply non-price determinant factors. Now moving on to our very last one, which is long-run supply factors. If you can think of long-run factors as changes in productivity, then you would be correct. So our changes in productivity are going to be things like a growth in the labor force, and the same thing will happen with a decrease in the labor force as well, except it'll shift the supply curve to the left. Then we have capital, changes in capital, both physical and human. Then we have natural resources. Along with technology technological advancements, and government regulations. There we go. And one thing to remember is whatever shifts the long run supply will shift the short run supply, but not everything that shifts the short run supply will shift the long run supply. Now we're going to go ahead and put this into practice by practicing aggregate demand curve shifts and movements. Going to the first practice problem, it says, how would you shift the aggregate demand curve based on an increase in consumption? Starting off by drawing our original aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. Since we are having an increase in consumption, that is going to be an increase shift in the demand curve to the right. Next up on our next problem, it says, how would you shift the aggregate demand curve based on a price increase? So I'm going to go ahead and draw our original demand curve once again. And I'm going to put a little dot right here, basically saying where our equilibrium is. Now, since we have a price increase, that is going to be a movement upward on the demand curve. And I'm going to go ahead and point that just for some reference with our price 2, which is where our new equilibrium point is, and price 1, where our original point was. Now for the next problem, it says, how would you shift the aggregate demand curve if there was an increase in sales taxes? Now I'm going to go ahead and draw our original demand curve once again. And since there is an increase in sales taxes, that is actually going to be a decrease on the demand curve, which is a shift to the left. And last but not least, it says, how would you move the aggregate demand curve if there was a decrease in price? Now I'm going to go ahead and draw my original demand curve once again and have a little point for equilibrium. Now, since we are decreasing the price, that is going to be a movement along the demand curve downward, closer to the y-axis, marked by that little blue dot right there. All right, time for our next practice for short and long run supply. Now we're going to go ahead and practice some shifts in the short and long run aggregate supply curves. So we're going to go ahead to the first problem, which says there's an increase in oil prices. How will this change the short run aggregate supply curve? So I'm going to go ahead by start by drawing the original aggregate supply curve, short run. And since it says there is an increase in oil prices, that is going to decrease the aggregate short run supply curve and shift it to the left. Now moving on to our second problem, it says there is a decrease in oil price. How will this change the short run aggregate supply curve? Now I'm going to go ahead and draw our original graph out again. Now, since there is a decrease in oil price, I will be able to draw a outward shift to the. Now down here for short and long run supply, we have an increase in physical capital. So we're going to go ahead and draw our original long run supply vertical graph. There we go. Now, since we have an increase in physical capital, this is going to be represented by a rightward shift of the long run aggregate supply curve, shown as so. And for our next problem, it says there is a decrease in physical capital. How will this affect the long run aggregate supply curve? So I went ahead and drew the